So this week we'll be looking at taxonomy and classification. It's a pretty brief overview, but it's at least going to give you some understanding of how we frame this idea of classifying things. It's actually a lot more complicated than it might sound. So here's a funny little poster. Somebody thinks they found a cat. Of course, that's a possum. So they failed at taxonomy just a little bit. So what are these two things? When we talk about classification and taxonomy, we're dealing with the grouping of organisms based off of molecular, genetic, and physical characteristics. And it also involves naming, and so that's going to be a big part of this. How do we come up with the names for organisms that we do? So the biggest system that we use today, in fact really the dominant one, is Linnaean naming. So the Linnaean classification system refers to this binomial nomenclature that you see with the scientific names of organisms. And it was established by a botanist named Carl Linnaeus. And so this system, basically your scientific name has a genus name and then the species name. And we'll go over what exactly the genus is and the different levels, how we classify from the large, broad category of living things down to the specifics. So the genus and species name is basically the scientific name. It's a two-part name, and hence the word binomial, meaning two-part name. So all scientific names for organisms go by this system. And basically, proper grammar in this system dictates that the genus is capitalized, the species is lowercase, so you don't capitalize the species name, and the whole name is italicized. So that's just part of the protocol for listing the scientific name of something. And just another little tidbit of information, the species part of the name is known as the species epithet. So the species epithet refers to just the species part of the name. So if we continue here, I'll show you kind of an example. So as we classify organisms, we start with a broad categorization. The animal kingdom. Now kingdom is not currently known as the largest category. As we're going to see, domain is the largest category of organisms. But for the longest time it was kingdom. So if we start with kingdom Animalia, here's all some animals that belong in the animal kingdom. Sea stars all the way up to grizzly bears. So if we break it down further, if we look at just one phylum within that kingdom, phylum Chordata. Chordata is the category of animals that have a spinal column. Then that eliminates the sea star. The sea star is an invertebrate. It does not have a notochord, so it can't be called a chordate. We'll be getting into that classification later in the semester, but for now we're just using this as an example. So if we look within phylum Chordata and break it down even further into the class of mammals, class Mammalia, that eliminates the snake. So now we're looking at just mammals. And then order, we have order of carnivores, carnivora, so that eliminates the squirrel. And then we get down to even more specific into the family. Ursidae is the family of bears, so that eliminates the fox. And then Ursus is a genus of bears that include grizzlies and black bears and most of the North American bears. That eliminates the panda. And then the species here, Ursus arctos, is the grizzly. So we've gone from all the way up in the kingdom, all the way down to the species. So the genus species name is the scientific name. So Ursus is the genus name, and it's also the first part of the scientific name. Arctos is the species epithet, so that's the specific part. Okay, so the black bear, for example, would also have a scientific name beginning with Ursus because it's in the same genus, if that makes sense. So that kind of breaks down how we do the naming. A little bit about taxonomy, so a little bit about this classification process. Like I said, kingdom used to be the largest category. You start with kingdom and you work your way down, and it's broken down even further. But domain is kind of a more recent addition to this classification. So we've basically come to this conclusion based off of studying microorganisms. So there's three domains of living things. Archaea. So archaea are a type of microorganism very similar to bacteria. Eukarya. Eukaryotes include animals and plants and fungi. And then there's a bunch of single-celled organisms that are also eukaryotes. And then bacteria, or eubacteria, is of course the domain that consists of bacteria. So if we look at it a little bit differently here, we have bacteria as one domain, archaea as another domain, and then eukarya as this final domain. So here's some examples in eukarya. We have animals, of course, fungi, plants, like I said, and then there's some other interesting organisms: slime molds, ciliates, flagellates, diplomonads. These are all single-celled eukaryotes. Think of a paramecium, for example, would be in this category. Archaea, like I said, they're kind of like bacteria. They're smaller, single-celled prokaryotes. So archaea and bacteria are both considered prokaryotes. They're both organisms that lack a membrane-bound nucleus, which we'll look at here in just a moment. So within bacteria, you've got some cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae as it's called, purple bacteria. There's a lot of categories. And as you can see, there's even a couple that kind of overlap a little bit. Okay, so the entoamoebae is a eukaryote, but it kind of maybe has some archaean qualities to it. So these lines are not drawn exactly clearly. There is some fuzzy overlap, and life is complicated that way. But this is the most general way we can classify it. And you know what? It's true that classification changes. And so some people say, well, how can we rely on anything if how we classify changes? But really, it's just simple. You know, the more information we get about living things, the better we can categorize them. So that's really what it is. And this may change as well as we continue to learn about living things. So again, like I said, the domains bacteria and archaea are both prokaryotes, and then the domain eukarya are, of course, eukaryotes. So here's some differences between them. And you learn this in biology, but we're just going to briefly look over it. Prokaryotic cells, remember, they do not have a true nucleus. So a eukaryotic cell has a nucleus with a membrane around it. Prokaryotes, they have kind of a nucleoid region, basically. So they have like a bundle of their DNA that's sort of free-floating in the middle of the cell. It's not constrained by a membrane, so it's not really organized or held in. There's some similarities, of course, between them. They both have ribosomes. They both, of course, have DNA. That's a critical part of being a living thing. They have a plasma membrane and a cytoplasm, so there's some similarities. But prokaryotic cells, of course, they don't have that membrane-bound nucleus. Usually, they propel themselves by either a flagella, which is this nice long piece here, or cilia, which are these little hair-like fibers sticking out of it. And eukaryotic cells can have that as well, so that's not totally distinct, even though it is in the picture. Prokaryotic cells are also much smaller. As you can see, they average from 0.1 to 10 micrometers across, whereas a eukaryotic cell can be 10 to 100 micrometers, so it tends to be a little bit larger. And you might notice, of course, some other differences here. The eukaryotic cell has mitochondria, it has Golgi apparatus and endoplasmic reticulum, if you remember those things from biology. So the eukaryotic cell is a lot more complex. There's a lot more going on. The prokaryotic cell is a lot more simple in its structure and function. So another term that we're going to use here in talking about classification is understanding phylogeny. And phylogeny is basically the evolutionary history of a species or a genus or a group of organisms of some kind. So the phylogeny, for example, if we go back up here to our bears, if we're trying to understand the phylogeny of, say, order Carnivora, we're looking at carnivores and we're trying to understand their relationships to each other. You know, how far back do we have to go in time till we find a common ancestor between the grizzly bear and the black bear, or between the panda bear and the fox, for example. Okay, so that's phylogeny. A phylogenetic tree, when you think of a family tree or a tree of life or an evolutionary tree, its purpose is to show those relationships. It kind of shows who's most closely related to who. And so here on this tree, here's vertebrates, which is the category that we are in. Phylum Chordata includes vertebrates. And we're actually kind of more closely related to an interesting organism called the sea squirt, which you'll learn more about this semester, than we are to other invertebrates, such as arthropods, insects, and crabs and lobsters, echinoderms like starfish. So it's just showing common ancestry, kind of who's most closely related. And it's a great way, again, it's a great tool to understand relationships, but there's another way of charting living things that kind of takes into account their characteristics, their common traits. and that is the study called cladistics. So it's a study of the classification based on when certain characteristics arose during evolutionary history that define these living things. So a cladogram shows which organisms have a common ancestor, but more importantly, it shows what characteristics define that organism. So on a cladogram, we have on one end of the spectrum, so on the far left hand here, down at the bottom, these would be the more simple organisms, and then up in the right-hand corner, these would be more complex. So a cladogram shows a progression of complexity where we have new traits coming in. It's not showing ancestry necessarily. You do see who has common ancestors, but it's not showing you a evolutionary timeline. All of these organisms exist today. They are living things today. None of them in this example here are extinct. So it's not showing you a timeline progression. It's showing you a complexity progression. So for example, here's hagfish. Hagfish, they're a type of vertebrate that are kind of similar to bony fish, but they have some differences. And one of those differences is they don't have jaws. So the characteristic for jaws comes in a little bit later. So to the left of the characteristic are organisms that don't have it. To the right of that characteristic, along the entire timeline, are organisms that do have that trait. So everything from this point on up has jaws, for example. And then fish have jaws. These are bony fish, but they don't have lungs, so they would go in between the two. Everything from this point onward has lungs, and so on. So you can see how this works. You'll notice there's also traits that are on the specific branch for an organism, like here the birds, the pigeon. Feathers would be a trait that's specific to that group that's not necessarily a part of every other group. So it belongs on the bird branch, if that makes sense. So we'll be playing with cladograms a little bit as we go, but that gives you an overview of how they work. Here's an example of a cladogram that I did and that you guys will be adding to when we learn about marine invertebrates. Here's a phylum of invertebrates, Porifera. If you think of the word pores, then you might know that this means sponges. They're the most simple phylum on our cladogram, so they go on the far left. As we work all the way up, chordates, that's organisms with a spinal column, and this includes vertebrates. So this is the more complex. And so we see a lot of traits here that make up the chordata. So the more traits that make up a group of organisms, the more complex it is, basically. So again, each mark on the cladogram has a characteristic. It's called a derived characteristic, or basically traits that evolved after an evolutionary divergence. So what that means is that, for example, cnidarians, that includes jellyfish, and sponges are both rather simple categories of organisms, but as evolution progressed, they might have diverged from each other when one of them evolved true tissues. So true tissues would be like skin, for example, or epidermis, ectoderm, mesoderm. These are types of tissues. Sponges don't have them, but cnidarians, and in fact everything from this point on, does. So that would be an example of a derived characteristic. We can compare characteristics, and we can study comparative anatomy to see some evolutionary relationships too. Here's a fun fact. Basically, all vertebrates have 5 phalanges. Phalanges means fingers for us, but it also means these bony structures within the fin of a dolphin, the finger-like structures within a bat's wing, and even within a cat's leg, and even within the hoof of a horse. You have fused phalanges that have come together. So we all have 5 of those, whether you're a dolphin or a cat or a human or a bat, which is pretty cool. So like I said, fun fact about vertebrates, but here's a fun fact about cetaceans. If we're talking about whales and dolphins and porpoises, they all actually have hair on the tip of their snout, which is pretty interesting, kind of like whiskers. So here's an evolutionary progression of cetaceans. They all have some similar structures to them, and they actually came from a common ancestor. Here at the bottom is an extinct ancestor of modern whales and dolphins and porpoises. Yes, it was a land animal, and we'll be learning about that later in the course. So this is showing, this is the modern cetacean, and then these are its ancestors as we go further back. Okay, so that kind of summarizes our classification. Let me know if you have any questions and if there's any issues with these notes.